Welcome to the debate. Today, we are examining a deeply pervasive and frankly deeply misunderstood physiological phenomenon, the tired but wired paradox.
Yeah, we're talking about that excruciating state where, an individual is physically exhausted, maybe they have been awake for days, yet they remain neurologically incapable of resting. They are just trapped in this state of high-voltage vigilance in the middle of the night.
Right, and we will be drawing on a comprehensive mapping of sleep anomalies, the autonomic nervous system, and chronobiology to address a fundamental academic disagreement here. The central question before us is this: is the tired but wired state a pathological malfunction of a broken, anxious brain, or is it a perfectly functioning evolutionary survival program operating exactly as designed? I will argue that this state is a neurological breakdown driven by hyperarousal and maladaptive plasticity.
And I will argue that it is a functional evolutionary adaptation known as the sentinel phenotype, combined with a physiological state best described as a high-energy coma.
Well, to really unpack this paradox, we have to start by looking under the hood at the neurobiology. What you are calling a survival program, I see as a catastrophic structural failure of the brain's regulatory mechanisms. This is not an adaptation, it is a breakdown. The clinical data often refers to one of the primary drivers of this state as the emotional lobotomy.
Which is a heavy, almost terrifying term, honestly.
It is, but it's incredibly accurate to what is physically happening. Look, even after just a single night of severe sleep loss, the brain chemically and functionally severs the connection between the medial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala.
Right, so to break that down for someone who might not be looking at brain scans every day, the prefrontal cortex is basically the logical executive CEO of the brain. It is the part that looks at the environment and says, hey, the doors are locked, we are safe, you can calm down.
Exactly. And the amygdala is your threat detection center. It is the fire alarm. Normally, the CEO keeps that fire alarm in check. But in this tired but wired state, that communication line is cut. Without the prefrontal cortex applying its inhibitory brakes, we see a massive, around a 60% surge in amygdala reactivity to negative stimuli.
The fear center is completely unmoored.
Precisely. You are perceiving threats everywhere, because the logical part of your brain has been locked out of the control room. And it is not just a structural disconnect, it is a chemical one as well.
The chemical brake failure.
Yes, individuals suffering from this chronic sleeplessness show a 30% reduction in GABA. GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It is the chemical brake pedal.
So when GABA drops,
the system is flooded with excitatory glutamate, which is the gas pedal. You ever lie there in the dark and your thoughts are just racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, bouncing from one anxiety to the next? That is the glutamate flood. The brain is essentially speeding down a highway with the brake lines kept. And perhaps most alarmingly, the brain engages in what is called maladaptive plasticity.
Meaning it learns to stay awake?
Yes, the motor cortex physically rewires itself to become highly efficient at being awake. It becomes a light switch that is permanently fused in the on position. The brain hasn't just failed to sleep, it has erroneously learned wakefulness as a permanent pathological state. Think about how wild that is for a second. The brain is literally rewiring its own architecture just to get better at panicking.
Look, I come at it from a completely different way. The clinical symptoms you just described are completely accurate, but your interpretation views them as a disease rather than a defense. The brain is not broken. It is successfully executing ancient survival hardware in a modern environment that completely lacks authentic safety signals. To understand this, we have to look through the lens of the generalized unsafety theory of stress, or GUTS.
Which really flips our traditional understanding of stress on its head.
It completely inverts the paradigm. For decades, we assumed that the stress response was a switch turned on by a threat. You see a predator, the alarm goes off. GUTS argues the exact opposite. Stress and terror are the default states of the human organism. The prefrontal cortex, your logical CEO, must actively inhibit that stress response when it perceives safety.
Meaning the brain has to actively hold the snooze button down on our anxiety.
Exactly. And when authentic safety signals are absent, which they frequently are in our isolated, high-pressure modern world,
The brake is simply lifted and anxiety is released by default. This leads directly to the sentinel hypothesis. The anxious, sleepless individual isn't a malfunctioning unit. They are an evolutionary phenotype. They are the designated watcher of the tribe, biologically wired with thinner boundaries to detect threats while the rest of the camp sleeps.
But they aren't just standing watch. They are suffering from crushing exhaustion.
Yes, but when the sentinel lies down, they don't just experience a lack of sleep. That profound, heavy exhaustion they feel is the metabolic cost of high-energy coma. They are entering a dorsal vagal freeze response. The body is slamming on the sympathetic gas pedal, the fight-or-flight system, and the parasympathetic emergency brake at the exact same time. They are burning massive amounts of energy to remain completely still, bracing against an invisible threat.
That is a neat theory, though I would frame it differently when we look at the actual mechanics of how the brain processes the environment at night. Let's examine the thalamus. The thalamus is essentially the bouncer at the gateway of consciousness. Its primary job during healthy sleep is sensory gating.
It actively blocks external information.
Right. It inhibits the flow of sound, light, and physical sensation from reaching the cortex, essentially closing the door to the outside world so you can rest. In the tired but wired brain, this gate objectively fails. But it doesn't just fail to block noise, it inverts. The thalamus engages in sensory gaining.
It turns the amplifier up to 11.
Exactly. It actively amplifies environmental noise. You are lying in bed, it is 2 in the morning, the house is dead silent. Suddenly, the house settling or a floorboard creaking literally sounds like a gunshot. The bouncer has suddenly decided to hand out megaphones to every tiny sound. This keeps the flip-flop switch in the hypothalamus, the tiny cluster of cells that acts as the master light switch for sleep, in a highly unstable metastable state. The switch gets stuck halfway. It is flickering. You are hovering in a biological twilight because your sensory filter has suffered a structural glitch. It cannot shut out the noise.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that this is a glitch. Let me tell you why. Sensory gaining is an intended feature, not a bug for the sentinel phenotype. The sentinel's brain treats the silence of the modern bedroom as a threat environment. In the ancestral world, total silence didn't mean you were safe. It often meant a predator was stalking nearby and the insects had gone quiet.
So the brain views the quiet suburban bedroom as an ambush waiting to happen.
Yes. Therefore, the brain deliberately lowers its sensory threshold to scan for danger. You mentioned that the brain amplifies the ticking clock or the floorboard. It does that because it is actively hunting for the snap of a twig. It refuses to surrender to the vulnerability of unconsciousness because its neuroceptive scanner has calculated that safety is an illusion. You are calling it a broken gate, but a gate that is intentionally left open by a guard expecting an attack is not broken. It is functioning exactly according to the smoke detector principle.
The idea that it is better to be safe than sorry, biologically speaking?
Precisely. Evolutionary hardware heavily favors 1,000 false alarms over a single missed threat. The cost of a panic attack is metabolically cheap compared to the cost of being eaten. The sentinel thalamus is amplifying the signal because it is doing its job.
Look, you can dress it up as an evolutionary feature, but let me give you a different perspective on the sheer physiological damage this so-called feature inflicts on the organism. If this were a sustainable evolutionary program, it would not result in the rapid deterioration of the brain's physical architecture. Let's connect that crushing physical fatigue we talked about to the toxic bath that occurs when the system fails to sleep.
Ah, you are referring to the glymphatic system.
Yes. Think of the glymphatic system as the brain's nightly dishwasher. By failing to enter deep, slow-wave sleep, the brain cannot turn the dishwasher on. During healthy deep sleep, your brain cells, specifically glial cells, actually shrink in size. This allows cerebrospinal fluid to rush in and wash away neurotoxins that have built up during the day, specifically beta-amyloid plaques.
The cellular waste of conscious thought.
Exactly. But in the hyper-aroused, fragmented sleeper, this nightly rinse never happens. The profound exhaustion, the heavy limbs, the cognitive brain fog, these aren't just subjective feelings of tiredness. They are the literal, clinical symptoms of a brain drowning in its own cellular waste. It is suffering from excitotoxicity due to that glutamate flood we mentioned earlier. If this is an evolutionary survival mechanism, it is a remarkably self-destructive one that ultimately destroys the host's sanity through metabolic breakdown.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered that the physical devastation you are describing is a symptom of our environment, not a flaw in the original program? I completely acknowledge the glymphatic failure and the buildup of beta amyloid. Those are measurable biological realities. However, the profound physical weight, that wooden statue feeling of crushing lethargy, is deeply misunderstood if we only look at it as neurotoxic buildup.
How else would you explain it?
We must look at polyvagal theory, specifically its bottom rung, the dorsal vagal complex. The exhausted individual is in a state of tonic immobility. The body is executing a primal shutdown response. The fatigue is the immense caloric cost of the high-energy coma. The body is bracing against a chronic, abstract threat, like a looming mortgage payment, an overflowing inbox, or social isolation, that it cannot physically fight or flee.
Because the threat is psychological, but the physical response is primal.
Exactly. Because our modern environment is a delayed return environment, the threat never actually resolves. You can't punch an email, you can't outrun a mortgage. So the survival energy mobilized by the sympathetic nervous system is never physically discharged. It becomes locked into the body, literally stored in the fascia and the deep psoas muscles. The exhaustion isn't just a brain full of waste. It is a body fighting a two-front physiological war against itself. You are burning a marathon's worth of calories while lying perfectly still under a duvet.
I am just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it ignores the very specific, measurable, hormonal and metabolic errors that occur in these individuals, particularly during the middle of the night. Let's look at the 3 a.m. awakening phenomenon, which is the absolute hallmark of the tired but wired paradox. We all know that feeling. Your eyes snap open, the clock says 3 a.m., and your heart is pounding out of your chest for absolutely no reason.
Yeah, the witching hour of anxiety.
Right, but it isn't supernatural. It is a chemical sunrise. At 3 a.m., the human body reaches its metabolic nadir. Your core body temperature is at its absolute lowest and melatonin is peaking. But in the anxious brain, an exaggerated cortisol awakening response, which is a hormonal surge supposed to gently wake us hours later, misfires. It causes a premature, violent spike in stress hormones.
And that usually happens alongside a blood sugar crash, doesn't it?
Yes, nocturnal hypoglycemia. After hours of fasting, blood sugar drops. The brain, which is a massive energy consumer, senses a fuel crisis. It hits the panic button and dumps adrenaline into the bloodstream to liberate stored glucose from the liver. This adrenaline dump triggers a physiological panic attack in the dark. The mind wakes up to a racing heart and frantically searches the bedroom for a psychological reason for the terror, when the reality is simply a biological collision between low blood sugar and a misfiring nervous system. It is a clear error in timing and fuel management.
I agree entirely on the hormonal and metabolic mechanisms you just outlined. The cortisol spike and the adrenaline dump are absolutely happening. But I strongly disagree that they represent a biological error. We have to reframe the 3 a.m. awakening using the lens of chronobiology in human history. Before the electric light bulb and the Industrial Revolution, humanity did not sleep in a continuous, rigid 8-hour block.
We practiced segmented sleep.
Right. Pre-industrial humans slept in 2 shifts, separated by a period of quiet wakefulness around 2 or 3 in the morning known as the watch, or the door veil. This interval was a designated time for reflection, tending the fire, or intimacy. Research has shown that in natural darkness, this waking period is accompanied by a massive surge of prolactin, which is a hormone of deep relaxation.
So you are saying the wake-up is natural, but the panic is manufactured.
Precisely. What you are calling a chemical sunrise is actually a ghost rhythm, echoing our ancestral pattern. The pathology isn't the waking itself. The pathology is our modern, light-polluted, industrial compression of sleep into an 8-hour block. Because we have lost the cultural container for that midnight wakefulness, the modern sentinel wakes up, looks at the clock, believes their sleep is fundamentally broken, and panics. That panic is what triggers the adrenal axis to flood the system with cortisol instead of relaxing prolactin. We have turned a natural biological pause into a source of terror, simply because we are living in the wrong century.
That historical context is fascinating, and I don't doubt the existence of the door veil, but we cannot romanticize the present physiological reality. Even if the 3.0 a.m. awakening has vestigial roots in segmented sleep, the current manifestation in the tired but wired individual is wildly destructive. Let's return to the concept of maladaptive plasticity. When the brain repeatedly experiences this nocturnal adrenaline dump and the subsequent rumination, it actively reinforces the neural pathways of wakefulness. The bedroom becomes a trigger.
The brain learns that the bed is a place of high-stakes cognitive processing.
Exactly. You mentioned the smoke detector principle, suggesting the brain prefers false alarms to missed threats. But when a smoke detector never turns off, it eventually burns out the electrical wiring of the house. The continuous state of central nervous system hyperarousal across the 24-hour cycle causes intracellular degeneration of neurons due to metabolic stress. The cells actually begin to break down under the strain. The machinery of the mind begins to physically degrade. Whether it was originally an evolutionary adaptation or not, once the prefrontal cortex is severed from the amygdala and the GABA reserves are depleted by 30%, the system has lost its regulatory capacity. It is a machine that is tearing itself apart.
I don't disagree that the machine is experiencing extreme wear and tear, but I challenge the notion that it has lost its regulatory capacity. It is regulating exactly as it should based on the data it is receiving. The problem is that the data is utterly corrupted by our modern environment. Let's look at the environmental inputs triggering this response. Our circadian systems are governed by light, specifically special light sensors in the eye that communicate directly with the brain's master clock.
The intrusion of artificial light.
Right. Artificial blue light from our screens at 11 at night doesn't just suppress melatonin. It projects directly to the anxiety centers of the brain, stimulating the neural substrates of despair independent of sleep. We live in an inverted world. Think about it. It is too dim in our indoor offices during the day to properly anchor our circadian clocks, and it is entirely too bright at night to signal safety to the brain.
We are confusing our biology at both ends of the day.
Exactly. And furthermore, our gut microbiomes are desynchronized by erratic modern eating habits, which compromises the intestinal barrier. This leaky gut allows endotoxins to enter the bloodstream, triggering systemic inflammation that crosses the blood-brain barrier and inflames the amygdala. The sentinel is receiving two clear biological signals from the environment. It is permanently high noon, and we are actively being poisoned. Under those conditions, shutting down for 8 hours of vulnerable unconsciousness would be an evolutionary failure. The brain is sacrificing long-term structural integrity to survive what it perceives as an immediate, ongoing lethal threat.
I see why you emphasize the environmental mismatch. And it is undeniable that artificial light and chronobiological disruption play a massive role in exacerbating this state. However, emphasizing the sentinel narrative risks validating a pathology that requires active intervention. When the brain is locked in this bioloop, the individual is not functioning as a tribal watchman. They are suffering from severe cognitive impairment. We know that extreme sleep deprivation can eventually lead to local sleep intrusions.
Where parts of the brain fall asleep while you are walking around.
Yes, specific cortical columns shut down while the organism is behaviorally awake, creating a fragmented reality where dream logic literally bleeds into wakefulness. We even see anomalies like exploding head syndrome, where the brainstem fails to shut down auditory neurons sequentially, causing a massive, simultaneous discharge that sounds like a bomb going off in your skull just as you drift off, or sleep paralysis, where the brainstem fails to disengage the muscle paralysis of REM sleep, and the brain misfires, projecting the sleeper's own body map externally as a shadow intruder in the room.
Truly terrifying multi-sensory disintegrations.
They are. They are clear evidence of a neurological threshold failing under the weight of hyperarousal. If we simply view this as an evolutionary mismatch, we might ignore the urgent need to manually intervene and restore the chemical brakes that have failed.
That is an important distinction, and I am certainly not suggesting we ignore the suffering or the need for intervention. But the type of intervention changes drastically depending on how we view the root cause. If we view it as your broken machine, the solution is often to forcibly suppress the symptom, usually with heavy pharmacology that simply masks the arousal. But if we view it as the sentinel executing a survival program, the solution is to speak the language of the autonomic nervous system and provide authentic safety signals.
You are talking about manually overriding the biology.
Exactly. Using technologies of transition, rituals that manually override the anxiety circuits. For example, deep pressure stimulation, like a heavy weighted blanket. It mimics the physical sensation of being held or contained in a tribal sleep pile, signaling physical safety to the parasympathetic nervous system. Or resonant frequency breathing, like the 4-7-8 technique. By artificially extending your exhalation, you mechanically stimulate the vagus nerve, forcing a reduction in heart rate, and signaling to the brainstem that the environment is safe enough to surrender vigilance.
The cognitive shuffle's another fascinating one.
Yes, deliberately thinking of random, nonlinear imagery, a red bus, a banana, a violin, to mimic the scattered thoughts of early sleep. This tricks the brain's sleep onset control system into believing that because your thoughts are no longer coherent and threat-focused, the environment must finally be secure. We don't need to fix a broken brain. We need to convince a terrified sentinel that the war is over.
To summarize my position, in light of our discussion, while the evolutionary origins of human vigilance and the mismatch of our modern environment provide crucial context, the tired but wired state currently operates as a destructive and pathological physiological loop. The clinical reality is clear: a 30% deficit in inhibitory GABA, the chemical severance of the rational prefrontal cortex from the highly reactive fear center, and the toxic buildup of cellular waste due to a failing glymphatic system all demonstrate a neurological system in crisis. The brain's maladaptive plasticity has erroneously locked it into a state of continuous central nervous system hyperarousal. The anomalies we see, from the 3 a.m. cortisol spikes to the terrifying multisensory disintegration of sleep paralysis, are the symptoms of a machine that has lost its regulatory capacity and is physically deteriorating under the metabolic stress of its own unyielding vigilance.
And to summarize my perspective, labeling this state as a malfunction fundamentally ignores the brilliance and uncompromising logic of human biology. The anxious individual is the sentinel, functioning exactly as designed by the smoke detector principle, which correctly favors a false alarm over a missed threat. The profound exhaustion is not just brain damage. It is the immense caloric cost of the high-energy coma, where the body is bracing against modern abstract stressors it can neither fight nor flee. The root of the problem is our inverted world, a light-polluted, chronologically desynchronized environment that provides constant sympathetic stimulation, but strips away the authentic biological safety signals required to stand the sentinel down. The brain isn't broken. It is simply surviving an invisible siege.
I believe we have reached a point of convergence on one fundamental reality. The modern environment is profoundly mismatched with ancient human neurobiology. This clash creates immense biological friction. Whether we view the resulting hyperarousal as a structural breakdown or an overzealous survival program, we both agree that understanding the tired but wired paradox requires looking far beyond simple sleep hygiene rules. We have to examine the deep autonomic nervous system, the chronobiology of our internal clocks, and the complex chemistry of the brain's threshold states.
I completely agree. The friction between our Paleolithic hardware and our digital environment is the crucible of this phenomenon. And as our discussion of safety rituals highlights, there's still much more to explore regarding how we can manually override these ancient systems. The autonomic nervous system can be guided if we use the right sensory inputs to speak its language.
Indeed. We will leave it to the listener to decide if they view their own sleepless nights as a neurological glitch to be fixed or a primal survival signal to be decoded. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.